Welcome to the Ed Collab. Jim, Ellis, and I are excited to be here for the spring gathering. We're here to talk today about designing access for all learners. I'm Mark Overmeyer from Denver, Colorado. I've been part of the Ed Collab for 2.5 years now. I'm very excited to do some thinking with Jim today, who I first met at the American International School of Vienna when I was doing some work there about 3 years ago.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Ellis. I'm still in Vienna, Austria, and this is my first chance to work with the Ed Collab, and I'm incredibly excited. Almost excited as I was when Mark first brought together, in one of our many conversations, an exciting movie he had just seen because it connected so well to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, access, which we're going to talk about with you today, design thinking, universal design, hostile design, all these great concepts we're going to get to in a moment. And I could almost not contain my excitement about this movie he was telling me about. I knew the story to some degree, but not the characters, not the people, not the whole through line of this movie. So yeah, I'm excited to hear a little bit about it again. Mark, will you go ahead and set this up for us?
Sure. One of the things about this film, first of all, if you get nothing else from today's presentation, I would say watch this film. Judith Heumann is in the film, and she has done extraordinary work with the Americans for Disabilities Act. She's been a disabilities rights activist since the 70s. She had polio when she was a child, became a teacher, but was prevented from teaching in the state of New York because she was in a wheelchair and had to sue for the right to teach. Sure, she's one of those people. I guess the thing that I kept thinking about, it was so much about access, so much about the work she did, but also about that idea that why did I not know about her? Not that I know everyone, but I was a special education major when I was in college in the 80s. And I think of all the work that we learned about around disability rights, and yet I had never heard of Judith Heumann, I'm ashamed to say. So extraordinary advocate for disability rights, did so much in the States, and now it's extended worldwide around just access. And then as Jim and I talked about universal design, we started to talking about how this idea of access melds with universal design.
Absolutely. And in fact, let's go ahead and set up the three main parts of this. I think that you can speak pretty well to it.
So we're going to start with talking about differentiation versus universal design. And we want to say up front, there is a place for both, but today's presentation is going to mainly focus on how can we universally design our instruction in order to give access to all of our students. We'll talk about some really concrete things from the universal design world, including curb cuts, concepts around universal design and hostile design, and then connect those to education. And then finally, a concept we call micro moments, just ideas that you could use immediately as you think about how you design your interactions with students. And if you're a teacher leader or an administrator of some type, just those micro moments, that lens will also apply very well to your interactions with anyone in your building. So.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump right into it. There's a lot of theory, but there's a lot of practicality here that we're going to bring you. So I'm going to start off with just a bit of theory, and let's imagine this curb here. And a curb cut is something that's used to slope the experience from someone trying to go from sidewalk level down to street level. As we can imagine, oftentimes when we're looking for an accessible solution, we can imagine a curb cut, but we do it in education in many cases on a case by case basis. Sometimes we try to find a more universal approach to how we're looking to accommodate a learner or enable a learner to give them that better access. But let's consider the curb first, and maybe we want to move someone in a wheelchair down from sidewalk level to street level. And so we think of a solution that fits them really well. It's the right width, it moves at the right angle, and it serves all the needs that someone in a wheelchair might want. And so this first solution fits them really well, but it doesn't fit a pedestrian really well. Someone maybe with a permanent disability, but can still walk, or a temporary situation. And so we decide that we also need a pedestrian ramp, and maybe it's sloped and curved in a way, or not wide enough for a wheelchair, but it's ribbed and textured and at a great angle for a pedestrian. So now our pedestrians can move from this curb cut down to street level very effectively. But as you know, there's a lot of Amazon packages being delivered these days, and two-wheel dollies that have really fat tires and that are close together are incredibly efficient for delivery folks to use in order to deliver the packages we love. And so we decided to make a curb cut for them as well, because the wheelchair one was too wide, and the pedestrian one with the sort of sloped sides, if we can imagine it not being flat, it created too much friction for the wheels or something. And so now we have a perfect fit solution for the dolly, and that's kind of on the other side. And so in this instance, we are differentiating all of the solutions that we're coming up with. We're identifying needs, and we're creating tailor fit solutions for each of those needs specifically, but they don't fit the needs of anyone else outside of it, just what we can identify. Or, so that's differentiation, or we can imagine something that's a little bit more universal. And while this might look like a bit of a shell, imagine something wide and sloping that moves the person from, or delivery person or whomever we're talking about, from sidewalk level to street level. And it works well for all of those cases we had thought of: the wheelchair, the pedestrian that needed assistance, and the delivery person. And maybe it works in cases that we had never thought of before: really young children, or baby buggies, or the elderly. We've accounted for lots of things inside of this singular solution that is more accessible to not only the three cases that we had considered, but to many cases that we hadn't considered. And in this case, there's a universality to our design, and that access is fitting many needs at once.
Let's think then a little bit about differentiation versus universal learning. And again, we want to stress that each have their place. I want to go to what questions we might ask as educators, as teachers, when we think about how we design our instruction. So one of the things we might ask ourselves when we think of the differentiation lens is, what do I need to adapt for my students? So this could lead to, doesn't always, but it could lead to lots of small groups. It's like, what do I need to adapt for my students? You might have, this group needs this group needs this group needs this. And my experience, I'll just speak for myself, that when that happens, it's very hard not to think of deficits versus gifts. Like, oh, this is my group that's more advanced or perhaps gifted, a term often used in the United States. Or these are my students who they struggle, or they're struggling learners, or they're readers who are below grade level. No matter what we do, the tricky part about differentiation, or something to really think about, is, do we therefore design our instruction around perceived needs that we may want to question ourselves about? So let's go to universal design and think about the difference there. And this is straight from universal design, like literally universal design says, how can I create something? We added units and lessons, but if you look at universal design in terms of architecture, it would say, how can I design this, whatever I'm designing, so that it's usable by all without need for additional adaptation? So we added the references to students there. So the premise here is, if you think about what you can design so you don't need the additional adaptations, then that's best first instruction. Then you have clearer ideas about how to provide any additional support, because you're thinking about what will support all, just like that curb cut that Jim showed in the drawing. That's good for all. And that's sort of the premise. So let's continue that thought a little bit. So again, each has its place. And let's talk about what differentiation might look like. And this is a might. So if you planned and thought about differentiation, then you might think to yourself, okay, here are my students who speak multiple languages. What they have in common is that English is not their first language. So they don't have they're not in any way, it's not an issue. It's just that English is not their first language. So we might group students who speak multiple languages into a small group to provide them opportunities to verbally share their ideas in English first. So we might do some teaching, and then we might pull that group. Then we might think to ourselves, well, who needs extra support? And then we might meet with them and do some either verbal rehearsal or just talking them through some things to get them started using sentence stems for the concepts that we're working on. And then we might group some other students for advanced work, those we perceive as ready for advanced work. And I want to say up front again, differentiation, if it happens in the planning process, this is what we might do.
I find that concept really interesting, because I liked how careful you were when you were talking about differentiation, because it immediately can enable as many people as it disables. And it got me to this quote that you had shared with me from Cornelius Minor, who's, if you haven't found him on the internet or seen him speak, please do. This is a quote from his book, We Got This. Anytime an operating system like a school or curriculum consistently fails a specific subset of people, and that's kind of the key to this quote. for me, that specific subset of people. It's not the people that he's saying is going to be wrong, but it's the design of the system. And that's, again, that break in between differentiation and universally designing an experience for our students. That sometimes we can put too much energy into differentiation for a few and not universally design our school system, our classroom system, or a course as a system for the greater good of all the students. And that's
So when we look about this, so we had the work with thinking about what we might do as we design a classroom around differentiation. So this is the flip of that. So what if I planned the same lesson or the same idea with the concept of universal design? Then I might provide all the students, regardless, the opportunity to verbally rehearse ideas in partner pairs, because that's good practice. I might display sentence stems about the content for any students to use as needed and said, these are here. And ideally, I would develop those with them rather than just assuming in advance what they might need. And then finally, I would model advanced thinking. I wouldn't presuppose only certain students are ready for that kind of advanced thinking. I would model that perhaps throughout the lesson to have them think in advanced ways about the subject. I often think of this part of the lesson as what do people in the quote unquote real world do? So when I teach writing is what do real writers do? One thing real writers do is they use mentor text. So I often talk about mentor text and model text with all my students that I'm working with, whether they're preschoolers or university students. And I think perhaps I'll tell a very short story about the difference between the two and what I found that powerfully impacted my thinking about these two. And I call this the idea behind this, the idea that, well, what if they would have been able to do it without your help? That's sort of the premise behind this. I was working in a school as a coach, and I was asked to do a writing lesson. And so I pre-planned the writing lesson with a classroom teacher. There were a lot of students in the classroom, perhaps 60, 70%, who were learning English. Their first language was not English. It was an extraordinary school. So this was a first grade classroom. I did my lesson, and I found out just before the lesson was going to happen that the person in the school who was an expert on working with students who are learning English as their second language, or who have a first language that's not English, she was going to come and visit. So I decided right then to do this. So I did the lesson, and then I pulled that group. I pulled the group of students who were in that group of English not being their first language. And so it was a fairly large group because there were a lot of students, who were not English speakers first. So I pulled them and I sort of re-explained the lesson for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I sent them off to work. And in my debrief session, it was really interesting because she said, I want to talk to you about what happened. And so at first I thought I was going to get praise. So it was really a funny experience for me, because she said, what did you do? And I said, well, I pulled the students who didn't have English as a first language because I thought they would need my help. So I wanted her to say, I know, that was awesome. And she said, well, how did you know they needed your help? In other words, why didn't you let them start first and then decide? So this gets at what I'm talking about here, because she said you already let them rehearse. You already had some things up there for them to support themselves, but you assumed they couldn't do something, so you had to re-explain it. And she also pointed out the biggest disadvantage of that is I may have caused confusion, because after explaining it once, I explained it a second time in slightly different words. So again, universal design looks like you provide the opportunity for students to access the material the best way you can, designing it for access for all students. And then once they start doing whatever you are asking them to do, once they start the task, then you decide what's next for them.
all right. So that is, to me, the core of what we're trying to get at is how can we systematize or recognize those situations where universal design will be effective for what we're attempting to do. But I want to back up a step, and I want to talk about universal design, hostile design, and curb cuts very briefly with you to provide some language for you and your colleagues to consider how and where we are able to see these things in our school today from a design lens, and then jump back into the pedagogical ideas in education. And the first one is curb cuts. We've talked about curb cuts already. I kind of made the fun drawings for you, but I have probably my greatest curb cut I've ever found on the internet. It's got all those features I was talking about, the lighted strips, the haptic feedback, It's ribbed for texture and anti-slip. It's really wide. It's accessible from multiple directions. It's working incredibly well. So in this instance, a curb cut is doing so much more than providing access to someone in a wheelchair. And probably the example I will use forever, one of the very first times I was presenting on this, I asked a group of teachers, who can use this besides a wheelchair. And there were baby buggies and little babies and the elderly, all people in injured who were using crutches. All of those things were being brought up, and someone rose their hand and said, drunk guys in the middle of the night. And it's a situational one, but I hadn't thought about it. And in fact, this curb cut would do really well for the inebriated at night with the lighted strips and the gentle slope and the haptic feedback. It's got everything. Where our imagination can take us sometimes is the extent at which we can design universally for our students. It's really hard to encapsulate all the needs that students have and account for them individually. But if we make one great tool or make our system accessible, what we're doing is accounting for the things we can't even think about. And so that's the true idea behind universal design. This curb cut is universal design. It's universally accessible to many, and it's been designed for even what you can't imagine. And here's that image that you're seeing here, that whether it's the elderly or the postman or the buggy and so on, all the way around. If we can consider making the things that we do their very best, we have less work to do on the back end to support specific needs. And that kind of makes me think a little bit about, in universal design, just everyday objects that we can identify as something that we like or dislike or have been frustrated with or enjoy. And this right carrot peeler is the one that my Nana had in Phoenix, Arizona when I was growing up. And as part of our large Mexican family, she always wanted to cook for us. And she had arthritis that was quite bad. And her hand was sort of shaped like this near the end, kind of like I'm showing you with my hand right now. And what was interesting about that is that while she wasn't completely incapacitated, there was this limit where she couldn't cut with a knife anymore or use this carrot peeler. This is the one she had in her drawer. Maybe some of you guys had it as well yourselves. But this OXO one on the left side, I think she could have used pretty effectively and been able to make menudo a little bit longer, or tamales, or whatever it might be, and been that member of our family in the way that she wanted to be. But if I'm perfectly able-bodied, and if I had both of those in my drawer, there's only one I would pick to use. And I think you know where I'm going with this. It's the left one. The one on the left is more universally designed for all of our needs. And I don't have any particular needs for it, but I would still only use that one, assuming equal sharpness or something like that. So oftentimes the universal tool is still the best for those who have no particular needs as well, besides those that have specific needs, whether it is my Nana or someone in your family or myself or yourself. We're all probably leaning towards the one on the left. And all right, let's check it out where we would find that in education. And we see a picture here with very specific need pencil grippers. But then there's kind of a universally designed one that looks like a foam bike handle almost. It was originally designed for autistic children and marketed through a website that was selling school supplies to the autistic community, those who teach or work with them. But it gained a large following because it was great for everyone. Anyone could grip that pencil, no matter what it might be. So sometimes the universal design is a quicker answer that's more effective and creates a lot less effort when we are able to provide a great tool that anyone can adapt or use, rather than having a chest full of very specific answers or tools that might specifically answer some needs and not others. And that gets me to the idea of a school playground. And very quickly, I want to just tell a quick story. My daughter often struggled when she was really little, 3, 4, 5 years old, being on playgrounds with lots of other kids. On some of these elements in a playground, she might feel trapped or worried that something would happen when a lot of other bigger kids were around her. A pretty normal thing for young kids. And one of the first times that we traveled to a place where there was a wheelchair accessible playground like this, I noticed that not only was it wheelchair accessible, but my daughter got on the playground, and as people started showing up and more kids started coming in, I think we were the first ones there. Um, she didn't run off scared or crying or just sort of quitting being on the playground elements and just being around the outside of it. She stayed in there. And it turns out that not only was that playground wheelchair accessible for anyone who needed that kind of access, but it probably was accessible to people who were in crutches or had other physical needs. But it was also big enough and wide enough for my daughter's anxiety. So sometimes that in a idea of universality can take us, again, like I was saying, far beyond our imagination, and we can design tools that are far more effective than we could ever have imagined in the first place. And that gets to the categories, and I started mentioning them a little bit, but Mark has some thoughts on the three major categories that we can accommodate for in universal design.
This chart shows when someone has a particular type of disability or something that happens to them, for example, not necessarily disability, like you could be a new parent, but this is basically this is a real chart. If something is permanent, something is temporary, or something is situational. So if you are blind, that's permanent. If you have an arm injury, that's temporary. If you're a distracted driver, that's situational. So when we think about universal design, we want to build this into the ideas of how might we think about this in terms of teaching? Because when you think about access and we think about the work we do with our students and how we design our classrooms, Jim and I started talking about, do we inadvertently make some things permanent when they don't need to be? So I think let's name some obvious ones that should be permanent. So I have had students in my classrooms when I've taught over the years who were deaf or hearing impaired. So they had a sign language interpreter. Well, that was permanent, right? That was a permanent thing, and that's logical. However, I've also been in schools where it was required. One time when I was a third grade teacher, it was required that we had guided reading groups. We had to have guiding reading groups every day. This was sort of seen as a permanent thing. But as I learned more about reading instruction, and since that time, there's often that leaders in this field would say, how do you know they need to be in that group? In other words, what if they were better off to be reading independently rather than having you pull them in that group? So sometimes things become permanent just because it's the structure of the school. Is it better that it be temporary or situational? And one person who's really powerful in this work is Cornelius Minor, who Jim mentioned earlier. When I saw him present one time, he said that one thing he always does with his students, if he's providing some type of scaffold of support. So say, for example, he's writing narratives with his 8th grade students, and he realizes some students might benefit from some narrative sentence stems just to get them started. And he talks with them a little bit before he gets them started on their work. That's a possible temporary solution. He doesn't see it as permanent, because he always recommends when we do anything like that, when we think of them as temporary, we say to the students, let's decide when you won't need me to go through this with you anymore, right? Let's make that decision now. So I don't create this dependence on me to talk you through the beginning of your narrative. So they make a decision up front about, when is this going to change? When will I take the scaffold away? Scaffolds are not meant to be permanent. The situational part comes in a little bit like I was talking earlier about. When I did that lesson, I assumed that those students who did not have English as their first language would need me. If I made that permanent, that could actually be very detrimental to the students. And even if I made it temporary, I thought, oh, I'll just do it for a week or two. One possibility is just make it situational, see how it goes, and then walk around and see who might need you. So don't make the assumption up front that things won't go as needed. So again, in the classroom, that's kind of how we might apply these ideas of permanent, temporary, and situational.
Fantastic. Not only are those important things to consider when you're doing it, but just the reality of the access that you're providing. So this is kind of a fun slide for us to end this idea. Maybe we had thought about a great curb cut that was ready under all three categories: permanent, temporary, and situational. We were ready to launch, and it looked great, and our project was set to go. And we hadn't completely thought it all the way through. Sometimes the best laid plans don't work out, and in this case, it clearly didn't. So there's a lot of iteration and design thinking processes that can go into this as you're working with the faculty members on your campus, and you're working through the way to make these things happen and come to a reality that you're designing universal solutions and in caring about all the situations that you guys can account for universally, that something bad happens. It just it's the nature of things sometimes, and being aware and ready for those to iterate out of them is important. Now, there's an opposite to that, though. There's something called hostile design. And sadly, we actually employ this inside of schools. I think less and less all the time, but I'm certain that each and every one of you here in the conference today have experienced firsthand some sort of hostile design to the school that you attended, or one that you've worked in, or all of the above. In this case, the slide that we're looking at here, we're seeing spikes in the middle of a roadway that might have been designed as anti-homeless or anti-rough sleeping, or to push away vendors from selling stuff on the streets, or preventing cars from making U-turns when they're not allowed, or all of the above. But if we're thinking about homelessness in particular, these spikes here that we're looking at, similarly to the first ones, they're not solving homelessness. This set of spikes here are to prevent someone from laying down at this spot and getting some rest. But it's not solving the underlying causes of homelessness. It's just pushing it away to some other windowsill, to some other location, somewhere that it doesn't exist at the moment. And we do things that are hostile towards students in many cases. Sometimes it's how we speak to students. Sometimes it's structures and systems that we put in place in our schools. But those hostile elements are something that I like to call spiking students. If it's an element that is not designed to solve the underlying problem that we're dealing with, it's merely meant as a deterrent. It's those situations we're not teaching anymore. We're just spiking them. If it's tardies, a tardy slip is a spike. Dealing with the underpinning causes of what's making them tardy. Is it us as a system, as a school? Is it another teacher from another room? Is it a life situation that they have in getting to school every day? Is it about a bus schedule? What is it? But it's not being fixed with a tardy slip as they enter the room. That's just spiking them and telling them as they're entering the room, my relationship to you as teacher to student is coming with a punishment as you're walking in. And that spike is driving a wedge in between myself, the instructor, and the student themselves. And we can imagine this in many different ways. There are many types of spikes that exist in schools. And there are many ways in which we spike students. And we can, as an umbrella, think about that as hostile design that we can look for and remove from the schools that we have today. It's the exact opposite of universal design in that sense.
This kind of takes us to what might spike students. So recently there's been a lot of things in the press, depending on where you are, about certain texts from Dr. Seuss. So texts exclude or stereotype or misrepresent or be offensive, that might cause spikes in students. And so the way to think about this in terms of inclusion and access is, and on a text-based level, we need to think about how do we diversify our text? How do we make sure that our students have access into texts? If I'm a English teacher or a reading teacher, or media specialist, how do I make sure that texts are really an act of inclusion for students, so that there's a goal of increasing representation, because students find access through seeing themselves. And this gets at one of the concepts we've talked about a little bit, is that it's designing with the user in mind. I mean, who are my students? Who are the students in front of me? How can I include them in the text I choose and all the things I do during the day, not just text? I do want to give a shout out to disrupttext.org. It's on this slide. And the women here, Tricia Abarvia, Lorena Herman, Dr. Kimberly N. Parker, and Julia E. Torres. Julia lives in Denver. I'm very fortunate to know her. They've done a lot of thinking around this work. And if you want to dig more deeply into this idea of how texts can reflect our students, they've done so much great work, and they're not canceling out any text. They're talking about being more inclusive. And one thing that is a lens through, as I was rereading some of their work as we prepared for this presentation, one thing that can happen to us, especially if we teach English, is that we can develop a canon. We can have a permanent idea that certain texts must always be taught, when really we should think about, if we want to be more inclusive, are some of those things temporary? Are some of those things situational? If in our minds we think these texts must be taught to all students for all times, what we've done is we've not taken the user in mind first. We've decided, as we talked about earlier, when we looked at Cornelius Miner's ideas, is that we have this structure that may not meet the needs of all students. And then we may start thinking, well, what's wrong with these students that they don't like this particular text? Because this is the text, this is permanent. So it ties back a little to that idea, that previous slide about permanent things that we may think of as not needing to be so permanent.
It's fantastic. I was recently doing, I think, directly inspired by Julie Torres, following her on Twitter, and Disrupt Text. I went to my math textbook here in Vienna, Austria, the 7th grade math textbook. It was written by Pearson. I think Savas now owns it. There was a sale in between there, but it was written by Pearson. And I started evaluating the text for the male-female balance, whether it was a male situation or female situation, names or other contexts. I wanted to look at these lessons. I wanted to ask myself, I'm teaching out of this every day. What am I reflecting to my students? And is there a spike that's unintentional? I was hoping for parity, gender parity, 50-50, but it just wasn't the case. It was closer to 65-70% male in most all, like across the book when I analyzed it, and nearly 90% in some lessons. So there was a subtle spike or subtle message to the females and the girls who were in my classroom, that what they were experiencing in my classroom was a male-oriented situation. And so I had to do something about that. And in order to unspike this situation, I couldn't stop using this program that's vertically aligned in the curriculum at my school. I had to account for this. And so I started converting everything over to female situations in my lessons and my tests on my walls in order to try to claw back some of that gender parity. But I would certainly prefer to use a math textbook that is accounting for the populations that I'm teaching without accidentally or inadvertently spiking the students that I am teaching.
So that brings us to Goldie Muhammad and her work, Cultivating Genius. The idea that you might be spiking students inadvertently in your school by the use of deficit language. So one of the things that we need to think about to make education more relevant to all is this idea of deficit language. So do we have deficit language around students, things like at risk, defiant, disadvantaged? I was sharing with Jim as we were prepping for this presentation, the idea of an achievement gap. The last district that I worked in, we use that term endlessly. Which students, there's an achievement gap with students of color, there's an achievement gap with students who English isn't their first language. So this idea that there's a gap which implies some type of deficit. Rather than that could, the issue with that is it could cause us to design our instruction in a very particular way because we see them as having deficits. Just like Judith Heumann, when she began to teach, there was nothing wrong with Judith Heumann. There was something wrong with the building that wouldn't allow her to use her wheelchair to get in so that she could be a teacher, right? So the idea of deficits can cause a lot of spiking or harm or hostility for our students because we perceive them in a certain way. Language carries a lot of power. So Goldie Muhammad in her book really encouraged us to think about how we use that language, how we talk about our students, and what if we thought of them as having genius, as having ability, as having things they bring rather than things they don't bring. And that's going to get us to our next topic about how we can sort of use that in the design of our teaching.
I think one of the more interesting things that Mark and I have been able to work on, something that's new, a term, an alliterative term that has been around a long time, is micro moments. And we've kind of taken that term and looked at where is the language that we're using accessible or inaccessible to students and why. And a lot of that's really highlighted a lot of the things that we're talking about. They're in shaping the language and the dialogue that teachers are having with students is something that's free to do besides the time that we spend in it, but it feels really powerful as well. So if we look at those connections between teacher and student in that learning experience, that's where we come up with something called micro moments.
So when we think about micro moments, there's just ways that when we think about, again, designing this, I like the idea of pathways, not roadblocks. That's the idea that, so just think about, and these are going to be a little bit language focused, but it might provide a lens for you to think about how can even the small moments that I have with students be designed in a particular way. So these are a couple of these things are really focused on the language we use. So let's go through a couple of examples. So first, we might have a student who says, I didn't do my homework. And you might say, I'm going to email your parents. This idea of if that moment where the student says that, there's an assumption behind this, or maybe you have this permanent structure. That's what I always do. I'm going to email your parents.
Or it's what the school says we have to do. But Mark, doesn't this feel like a spike to a student? Like, I feel like,
Absolutely.
yeah,
This would be a spike. Yeah, because,
absolutely.
and sometimes these are built in, sometimes it's the small things that make an outsized big influence. It's like, if it's the rule, if the guidebook says I have to email your parents if you didn't do your homework, it's also not, it has nothing to do with the user. It has to do with the rules.
Right.
So what if instead they say, I didn't do my homework, and you say, okay, can you do it tonight? Do you need help? How about at lunch? So that keeps the student in mind. So that's the design here, is the design of my language is, rather than making assumptions, I go to the student and I wonder and I ask and then I investigate. So.
Yeah, I like it, in this example how you kind of set it up in a way that makes us think that the teacher is being reflective or inquisitive about the situation, rather than jumping to a conclusion as well. That it's that even just that pausing and looking to dig and think a little bit further, and sculpting that conversation is just so powerful. The second one is finding pathways, removing roadblocks one more time. But the second piece of it might be a situation like this. And this has happened to me many times in my career, especially having taught math for as long as I did or have. A student will come up to me and say, I am going to fail the test that you're going to give me. And early in my career, I've got to be honest, my answer was usually something like this: take it and let's see. And that was a bit of a spike to a student to some degree, but it was also not inclusive to their needs that they have, nor was I really digging into the situation that a student felt safe enough to present to me in the first place. Instead, maybe earlier in my career, I could have started to adjust to something more like this. I'm going to fail the test, and now me or a teacher saying, truly, would you be willing to take it after getting some help from me? When would you be available? Not only that, at this point in my career, I also say, don't take it. It's okay. Don't take it today. We're going to work out time where I can work with you or whatever it might be. But I preface a lot of what I do in my classroom with telling students that they don't have to do a test until they're ready. They don't have to do an assessment until they feel that they're prepared for it. That does put a little bit of onus on the student, though, because they've got to become prepared for it. With me now, there's a little more emphasis placed on the interactions between myself and the student, but they know that I've got their back, that they know that I'm going to help them through that experience instead of send them off to a failure.
And the third example of this pathways versus roadblocks is around what if a student wrote, in a story or something, my team won the game. And what if the first thing you notice is sort of that deficit thinking and you think about spelling? Is this what you might say to the student? The team is spelled T-E-A-M and game is spelled G-A-M-E. Did you see it on the board? So in other words, why aren't you using the tools around you to spell this correctly? That's kind of a spike, I think, because actually what's happening with that situation, if a student were to write this, like your first or second grader were to write this in a story, I think what they want is something, what I would call just more human, is like, that's so cool, I'm glad you won the game. It's like, respond to content first. So when this gets down to something like, that sort of deficit model might lead us to thinking of what aren't they doing? Whereas this, my team won the game, what are they doing? They're sharing something with me and I'm going to respond to that. And I think that ties in a lot too, Jim, doesn't it, with math? I'm sure that it'd be easy to walk around the room and see something that they're doing incorrectly in their math work, rather than what are they doing would be a different lens, which might cause more access to the student wanting to learn more.
I can't agree with you enough. Despite all of the great PD that's out there and wonderful pedagogies that we can adapt, the deficit model of teaching mathematics is still predominant. It's too easy to find the mistake and not easy enough to design a classroom that's built around what students are capable of doing and building up from that point and helping lift them and recognize where they are and lifting them a little bit further. So I really appreciate that kind of shout out there, because it's pervasive in mathematics education.
So to kind of wrap this up just a little bit with this idea of you can manufacture these micro moments for students to shine and show strengths and design these moments into the regular day. So the reason we connect this back to design is you can make the decision to design this in. I know I've seen a lot of different examples of teachers either online or just live or seeing them or reading their books about one of the big issues that we deal with when we're giving feedback to students is what do we say to them first? And many of the experts in this work, especially in reading and writing workshop, when we talk about feedback is, so sort of name what they are doing first. So as a quick example, if you design that in, rather than walking around the room and trying to find error, if you design in instead, I'm going to look for what they are doing. An example I can give you from many years ago, when I first decided to design my instruction that way, I walk around the room and I would just notice what students are doing. So one day I had taught a lesson in poetry and imagery, and students began writing. And I just walked around the room, and when I noticed a student using imagery, either I shared it or I had them share it, and I just named it as imagery. It didn't take long. And so one student I went to, her name was Carrie. She had written a poem. She had started writing a poem about being at the ocean, and it had imagery. And I said, "Would you mind if I shared this?" I shared her piece, a couple lines from her poem, and I just said, "This is imagery, and this is another example. These, we're doing this work. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?" Just to reinforce that we are doing this rather than pointing out error. I pointed out success. I pointed out something that was working. So it was about 10 years later. So she was about 11 when I taught her. She was a fifth grader, 10, 11. When she was in college, she got my email from her mom. I actually worked with her mom and her mother. And she emailed me and said, "I just wanted to tell you that we were talking in my college composition class today about a time I remember feeling like I was a writer." And she recalled that moment 10 years later. And I don't share that to pat myself on the back. I share that because it was just this micro moment. It was this little moment where I decided in the design of my teaching, I'm going to point out what is working for students. And just the trajectory of that 10 years later, for her, she had that memory. So these micro moments may not take a lot of time, but it may be what they remember you by, which is why we have to think about so many different aspects of how we design instruction, even down to these things like micro moments. So it wasn't by chance that that happened. It's because I designed it into how I was going to work with that particular writing lesson.
That's fantastic. It gets me thinking about so many stories that I've had while I've taught as well too. But for the most part, I've been working really hard, I think, to manufacture micro moments that are eliminating a lot of the friction, but enabling a lot of those fantastic moments. And like it says at the bottom, they've never been by chance or happenstance. It's come through a lot of hard work. And so I think you can be proud of that because there was no accident to that interaction. It was probably through years of experience that got you there. And it, in the work that you and I do together with teachers, being cognitive about that effort is a major piece of what we try to impart. And to kind of begin to wrap it up a little bit, designing with the user in mind. Primary materials are the accessible materials. Universal instruction should aim to provide access to all. And if you assume that students need you, then they will need your support. So those are three main ideas that we want you to be able to walk away with, and being able to flip that last notion on its head and leaving with the idea of that universality versus hostile design as well. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this one, Mark?
No, I think that's, exactly that this idea is that if we design with the idea of access for all first, we'll be a lot more flexible in our teaching when we go out to see how it's going. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, a reminder that when we design regular access for all students, what we're suggesting is that's a better method for being flexible as a teacher, because when you design for all of your students universally and you think about access, then you can start to see what your students need more in the moment and walking around and making sure and just being present with them based on the work they're doing at the moment. You can also manufacture those micro moments to look for where students shine, what they do, what they can do, rather than always having that lens, or too often having that lens perhaps, of looking at deficit thinking. So we really appreciate you being here today. We hope that you were able to get something out of this conversation. I always enjoy running these ideas by Jim and thinking through this, and we're thrilled that you've been here. Please reach out to either one of us if you have any thoughts to continue the thinking that we started today.
Yeah, thank you as well. I'm really proud to be a part of the Ed Collab. There's no doubt about it. So I'm looking forward to seeing more presenters and connecting with you guys on Twitter. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.